What does it mean to determine a moral act? This question leads us to two foundational questions. How do we define an act, and what makes it moral? We are defining an action in this case as a human action, as man possesses the great powers of the soul, the intellect, and free will. He is capable of making free and knowledgeable choices. This freedom is a great gift, but also bears with it the weight of great power. Precisely because man can make free choices and freely act, he is obliged to acknowledge the moral good or evil of his actions. As the Catechism says in 1730, God created man a rational being, conferring on him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his actions. An act is man's free decision to do something. Actions are inherently moral as they deal with objects that are either good or evil. This has to do with understanding the natural law and God's laws set forth to instruct man as to the goodness and evil of certain actions. There are three basic factors that allow us to determine the morality of a human action. They are, first, the object, second, the intention or end, and third, the circumstance. The object must be determined first, as it is the first determinant. The object is the specific act or behavior chosen by the moral agent, who is the person that is making the choice. The goodness or evil of the object is proper to the object itself, rather than determined by the moral agent. Therefore, some objects or ends are inherently good, such as respecting one's mother, while others are inherently bad, such as fornication. The determination of the object requires one to ask the question, what am I doing? This is not the same question as, why am I doing this, which is answered by the intention. The intention or end of an action is the subjective reason why the moral agent desires to choose that action. The intention answers the question, why am I doing this? Some intentions are good while others are not. If an object is determined to be morally evil, then even a good intention cannot make that action morally good. For example, perjury is a sin against the 8th commandment, and therefore is morally evil. Even in circumstances where the intention of the person is to somehow help another person whom he or she believes has been wrongly accused, perjury is still wrong. The seeming good intention cannot change the wrongness of the action. On the other hand, a bad intention can diminish the goodness of a good moral act. For example, it is morally good to give alms to the poor. However, the good is lessened when the intention is to impress someone with a false sense of magnanimity rather than to give sincerely with the intention to help those who are less fortunate. The circumstance is the manner in which the act is carried out. It is the when, where, and how of doing the act. This can be considered the means in which the desired act is done. It answers the questions, how, when, or where am I doing it? The circumstances do not make an act good or evil, but they can affect the moral act in two ways. They can increase or diminish the goodness or evil of an act, and they can increase or diminish a person's responsibility for an act. A woman who has had an abortion because her boyfriend is threatening her very life is less culpable than a woman who has had an abortion to play in a tennis tournament. In this case, the threat of violence, the act that they did is still an evil action, but the responsibility for the evil is diminished as they were coerced. Also, one may be given credit for a good act that may have been a byproduct of another intended act. The person has still completed a good action, but the credit for that action is diminished as it was not an intended act. Consequences of a moral act can be considered part of the circumstances of the act. man is to be held responsible for those consequences that are foreseen. A foreseen bad consequence can diminish the goodness of a human action, just as a foreseen good consequence may enhance the overall goodness of the action. For example, we may have an illness and consider missing a day of work to rest. When we consider the consequences, we recognize that others in our office may catch the same illness if we were to go to work without taking time to recover. The positive consequence of resting and healing also has the positive consequence of protecting others from sickness. We help to determine the consequences by asking ourselves the question, what would happen if I do this? Determining a moral action can often be more complicated than simply determining the object and making a decision. Frequently, when we take the time to think through the questions surrounding the moral decisions, we realize that many layers are involved. Some have been illustrated by the idea of imagining a stone thrown into a still lake. It creates ripples that spread out far beyond where the stone fell. This reminds us that our actions carry consequences, some foreseen and some not. We do have an obligation to responsibly consider our actions while accepting a logical point of fallibility, as we are not omniscient. This also leads to the additional element of one's conscience. The conscience is the moral law written upon man's heart by God. Man has an obligation to listen to that law, as well as a duty to properly inform it. Certainly, not all men instruct their consciences equally, and so there is a disparity among men concerning the moral goodness or moral evil of certain actions. Yet, even when man has been subject to ignorance and has been perpetuating that ignorance, that he is so unaware of the moral evil of an act, it does not negate the reality of that action's moral nature. For instance, a boy reared by wolves may not have as well-formed conscience as a person fortunate enough to be taking a moral theology course. But that doesn't change Wolf Boy's actions, which are either right or wrong, or neutral, based on what he does, the object, and what he intends, his intention. The circumstances probably make him less culpable for stealing food or cannibalism. Therefore, people have to form their conscience according to the truth, so that he may know the truth and act in justice according to the moral law. This leads us back to the first principle of determining a moral act, as man must be able to perceive the intrinsic goodness or evil of an action to determine if it should be done. If a man was sincerely ignorant of the natural evil of an action, he may decide to do an act that is evil while having a minimized responsibility for the evil action done. This also depends upon the level of culpability of the ignorance of this evil. This means that he cannot argue that he was unaware that the act was morally evil if he did not first consider the morality of the act or strive to inform his conscience properly. Man's actions are inherently moral due to the great gifts of reason and free will, and therefore he has a duty to recognize the moral goodness or evil of his actions.